You're absolutely fine.
All right.
We're not professional here. You should know that. So I wanted to do this type of podcast for a while because I suffer from anxiety and depression, and I want to make do an awareness episode of, I don't really know how I'm going to go about doing it, but I figured you would be the best person to have on here. So you're you're a psychologist, is that right?
No, I'm a I'm a clinical mental health counselor is what the official acronym is.
Okay. And what does that kind of entail as we kind of start?
Well, there's several different things. So you got the psychiatrist who's gone to med school, and that's pretty much just management. And then you've got a psychologist who's 4 years post-grad. You've got a licensed mental health counselor, which is 3 years post-grad. And then you've got a social worker, which is 2 years. So my degree is in between like a psychologist and a social worker. It's more clinical than a social worker. Yeah, if that helps, I don't know. But I would just announce me as a licensed mental health counselor.
All right. So when people come to you and they're like, hey, I need help, kind of what is your reservoir and how do you come about helping these people with different problems? Let's just say if I were to come to you today, Deb, and I was like, look, I'm having this intense anxiety. Whenever I lay down and go to bed at night, my heart sounds like a drum beat of a bass player. It's crazy. Kind of what would you kind of talk to me how you would go upon helping this person?
We're just going between you and I, right? We're not this is not the podcast, right?
Well, I mean, we're recording, but I can always edit it out if you want me to.
Oh, okay. I didn't know how your process was. If you start.
No, I do. I go by something called ABR, and it's always be recording because you never know what's going to happen. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Yeah. So I can always talk about I have a 3-prong therapeutic approach. So I can always talk about that. We can talk about, what's happening individually. We can talk about more of the global stuff if you want. I definitely would like for you to give a plug to my upcoming podcast, if you don't mind.
I have it written down here to talk about.
Okay. And then, so it just depends on which approach you want to take.
Okay, let's do the
three-prong approach would be, I always do a behavioral approach. Then I always do something more science-based, and then I do more of the psychological stuff too. It's a 3-prong approach to anxiety.
Okay, let's do the 3-prong approach. So what is your 3-prong approach towards somebody with intense anxiety?
When somebody comes to me with intense anxiety, I come at it with a 3-prong therapeutic approach. The first part is the behavioral therapy stuff. Here's some practical things that you can do to get through the anxiety. Here's a breathing pattern, which I like the what they call the box method, which is breathing in 4 seconds, holding 4 seconds, breathing out 4 seconds, holding the exhale 4 seconds. It's the same breathing technique they teach special forces. It regulates the body breathing so that the brain can start to learn that there's no danger. So we can stop distributing blood and oxygen to the muscular system because we don't have to fight anything or run away from anything. Also looking at diet, sugar, caffeine, big anxiety causers. Then there are anxiety friendly, food like blueberries and apples with the skin. You can Google an anxiety diet. We know that if you're moving towards like a panic attack or in a panic attack, you can get into a shower that's as cold as you can handle it. And the cold water will help the inflammation in the brain and calm the nervous system down. So and then of course, exercise, that sort of thing. So those are sort of the behavioral tips that I give people. And then there's also the way we view the world. The brain is a reciprocal of historical experiences. It's an automated system. And most people think that we are our brain, and we're actually not. The brain is an organ like the lungs, like the heart. When we can separate ourselves from our thoughts, then we can have a better shot at doing what Eckhart Tolle says, master the mind instead of the mind mastering you. And most, if not all, of anxiety is caused from the thoughts that we feed it. You have a symptom, you create a story, you have an experience, you create a story of fear, and then the brain responds. So looking at our thought patterns and the way that our brain is automated, and what I mean by automation is how we're wired, right? The brain wires into certain thinking and it becomes part of our DNA, right? So if we grew up in a fearful childhood and we're sort of wired for fear, then that's going to transpose into our adult life. The other thing is, we have to be mindful of what we call the ego, right? The ego operates on the pendulum of I'm the most important person in the world to I'm the least important person in the world. And all day long, it looks for stories to feed that belief system. None of those stories are true. But what that does is it puts us into the space of either victim or villain, or making someone else villain or victim. And in that space, fear can bloom, right? And so we want to dismantle that thought process and come into a more heart-centered approach where we look at things from a service point of view versus a victim villain's point of view. But service always comes with good boundaries, because good boundaries will also help stave off fear. And then the third approach for me is always, again, coming back to that historical experience. I look for patterns from family, patterns from past relationships. And we look at those patterns to say, are they serving us? Are they to our benefit, or are they to our detriment? If they're to our benefit, let's enhance those patterns. If they're to our detriment, let's dismantle them either through talk therapy or some of the brain rewiring techniques that we have access to. And when I take that three-prong approach, I can typically eradicate anxiety. There are a lot of schools of thought that says anxiety is something that you have to manage for the rest of your life or take medication for the rest of your life. I don't actually ascribe to that. I am more in the camp of let's get rid of it. I mean, we're always going to have the normal anxiety that we're wired from the survival part of the brain, like, oh my gosh, there's something truly threatening me. Anxiety kicks in, that amygdala fires, and we're off to the races. But when it comes to the anxiety that comes from our thought processes, we can eradicate those.
You mentioned rewiring the brain. Kind of break down what that means.
So when we talk about rewiring the brain, again, we come back to that automated system, right? We know from the research, I think Dr. Joe Dispenza does a great job of sort of bringing it to a level that people can understand. When someone is in a mood, an angry mood, if they stay in that angry mood long enough, then it's going to move into temperament.
Right.
If you stay in an angry temperament for a while, it'll eventually wire into your personality. And now we're going to say, oh, you're an angry person, right? So what has to happen then is we have to rewire the brain, coming out of the negativity into a positivity. So we have various techniques where we can focus on a negative cognition and actually rewire the brain into believing it's a positive net cognition. So I actually have a body of research that I've been working on for many years with my research partner, Dr. Bryce Kay. And we have developed a technique where you can go in using, what we do is we have someone relive a trauma. Let's just use a trauma, okay? And maybe from that trauma, the negative cognition is I am powerless, all right? So what we do is we have the client relive the negative cognition, And then as they're reliving all the sensory detail, we flip the brain from what is called what is called mastery state to sympathy state. We do that by bringing in what we call a resource memory. The resource memory is a positive experience of feeling powerful in your adult life experience. So then we get, and I'm already getting too much information out there, but essentially what we do is we confuse the brain, because the brain doesn't know what is real and what is not. And we're able to get an oxytocin release that then causes the brain to reassociate a different attachment to the original traumatic memory. So then what happens is that when you go back to that trauma memory after doing our protocol, you won't be able to feel the same level of fear around it anymore. You'll feel powerful instead of powerless. That's one technique. We also have EMDR, which is widely used now. More and more people are getting certified in that. The military uses that to do, some rewiring in the brain. And then there's another technique that's kind of up and coming called internal family systems theory, which actually supposes that every age you've ever been, every emotion you've ever had is a different brain part. And so when, you are having anxiety, then it's a younger part that's getting activated. And so what we do then is we seek out those younger parts, we heal those younger parts so that those don't get activated and cause negative emotions.
If someone comes to you and they're like, hey, I'm having this reoccurring nightmare, and it's like to the point where you don't want to go to sleep. Kind of that, because I was reading that maybe that is possibly a point, you're having that nightmare because it's a point in your life that you're reliving in a different state. Does that make sense? Is that kind of right?
Well, I think there's a lot of different schools of thoughts on dreams, right?
Uh-huh.
For me, if somebody came to me and was having a recurring nightmare, my first point of reference to in terms of assessment might be, is this somebody that's experiencing untreated PTSD? Or is this somebody that's been through a recent trauma? Because when the nervous system gets kicked up like that, it often carries into the dream state. Sometimes, and many people believe that dreams are also messages. If we look at Dr. Carl Jung, who was the original, not original, but one of the biggest bodies of work on dreams, analysis, then he would say that everything in the dream represents you. Every person in the dream, every experience in the dream represents you. So then you can start to piece together, well, what is going on in this dream that reflects what is going on in a struggle you might be having. So dream therapy is a whole different field. That's not really my expertise, but I would say that to me, it would be I would treat it if it's recurring, I would treat it as a symptom. Is it an ongoing nightmare, or is what we call a night terror? Those are two different things. So that would be just like more cause for exploration.
I always thought, and I wonder if you get patients that think this too, that PTSD only occurred in the military. Because when I went to therapy and they were like, hey, you have a little bit of PTSD. And I was like, no, there's no way, because I never served in the military. Do you get a lot of people that think that?
A lot of people think that, actually, and that's actually not true. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a diagnosable condition. We diagnose people from something called the DSM-5, which is what therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists use to diagnose. And you have to meet certain criteria in order to receive a diagnostic code. And that's then the code that goes to insurance, right? But in terms of PTSD, any trauma can cause PTSD. And trauma is highly dictated by the individual, right? What might be something very traumatic for you, Dylan, might be not traumatic for somebody else, and vice versa. So it's really how the individual is processing information. The first thing that happens when someone is exposed to a trauma or something threatening is, again, that fight or flight response that I kind of referenced a little bit earlier. And the brain kicks into anxiety so that the body can start to prepare. We're going to have to fight something. We're going to have to run away from something. If the brain stays in an extended period of time, then it can kick into acute stress, which will eventually move into post-traumatic stress disorder. The other thing to note is when we have a child or somebody who's more on the helpless side, when they're faced with trauma, if they intuitively know that they are not big enough or strong enough to fight or flight from something, then that brain is going to receive that information as an impending injury. When the brain thinks that you're about to be injured, it goes into a dissociative state. So when the brain checks out, because that's what a dissociative state is, if it checks out for too long, when it checks back in, that can also cause a stress response. So lots of factors come into whether or not someone's going to have post-traumatic stress disorder. When you have extreme situations like military experiences, then it's easier to see how someone can come into PTSD. But, losing a loved one, that might be harder to think of as PTSD and might be mistaken for grief. Oftentimes, children who have very traumatic childhoods get mixed diagnosed in different things like ADHD, when in fact they have undiagnosed PTSD. So that's a bigger conversation, right?
Yeah,
is a lot of factors that play into that, but that was a long answer to your question, which is yes, lots of people can get PTSD that are not related to the military.
No, don't apologize for the long answers, because that's what we're here for. I love learning about different things that I didn't know about. But kind of quickly, my PTSD, according to therapists I don't no longer see, but I was bullied and tormented in school, and it kind of went over into my daily life where it was like, oh no, because one thing that I always try to be positive about, but I think I come positive in a different way is, I'm not the skinniest person anybody's met. I'm kind of a heavier set guy. I'm 6 foot, and in school, it was always, I was never first in line to the cafeteria, and I was never last in line, because if you're first in line, that meant that, oh my God, you're starving to death because you're so fat. But then if you're last in line, that means you're going to get all the scraps that the people in front of you didn't get. I know that sounds crazy, but that's kind of what I live with every day. It's kind of the same thing with, like, I never order shirts online. I always get them from the store, because if it doesn't fit a certain way, like if it's too short, then I'm getting too big. I can't buy clothes that fit anymore. Or if they're too long, then you have to buy clothes bigger because you're constantly getting so big. Does that make sense? I know that's a lot, but does that kind of make sense?
So what you're describing is a patterned behavior that has continued from when you were a younger man, from your bullying experiences. So what then would happen then was, if you were coming to me in therapy, we would look for ways to disrupt the pattern. Because because you have a story that you picked up from childhood, right? Mm-hmm. That there's something wrong with the way you look, and therefore you have to position yourself in a way in the world to keep others from seeing what's wrong with you. Mm-hmm. And when you come into adulthood, we say, well, what if that isn't true? What if there's nothing wrong with you? What if you're exactly where and how you're supposed to be? How would that change your behavior? And we start to imagine a different way of moving through life. Does that make sense?
No, that makes absolutely sense. It's, I don't want to go into a whole therapy session here, but yeah, it makes complete sense. But I do want to touch on something that, because one of my favorite writers is Malcolm Gladwell. And this guy writes these crazy, I don't know if you've heard of him, but he writes these crazy.
The Tipping Point.
The Tipping Point. But one that really got me was Blink. And it's talked about going with your gut and telling your mind to, you know what, I'm going to go with my gut. I'm not going to go with what my mind says, because 9 times out of 10, your gut is absolutely correct.
Mhm.
Is that kind of what is that kind of true? Kind of what you see in sessions like that?
The way I look at it is more from the science standpoint, which actually Malcolm Gladwell does a fair bit of science in his books.
Right.
But what I would say is this: you have everything that you need at your age to handle whatever comes into your life, or it wouldn't come into your life.
Right.
If you start to create a story that it's too much, or you can't handle it, or you're not enough, then it is a wounded pattern that you've been carrying around. And when we can start to heal those wounded patterns that no longer serve us, we get very clear vision of who we are. And a lot of people call that gut. Because when we know who we are, then we intuitively know what boundaries we need. We intuitively know what's healthy for us and what's not healthy for us. And we intuitively know how to treat everybody with love and compassion, even people we disagree with. That's self-actualization. That's clarity. That's a healthy gut, if that makes sense.
You know, it's kind of like a negative attitude, kind of like if you constantly saying, you know, I'm not going to do this, I'm not going to do that, I can't do it, then you're constantly, everything that's going to happen, you can't do it. So you have to build that negative attitude. It's hard, but you got to build that into a positive attitude. And it's like, how are you going to make this positive? I'm not going to quit, I'm going to keep going. But if I do quit, that's okay, because you can always pick up the pieces and continue on.
Right. You want to re-automate the brain, because the brain has so many jobs, right? You wouldn't want to wake up in the morning and count your breaths, right? The brain does it. And because it's so taxed with running the entire body, then it pulls on historical automated systems in thought processes too. And what that looks like are different core beliefs that wire into the brain. And so that's why getting into the habit of pausing and observing your thoughts can go a long way to shift from negative to positive. We can say, is it true? Is it true that I have to get in the middle of the lunch line? Is that true? Or are there other possibilities for me? And just getting in that habit of pausing so that the brain doesn't wrap around it like it did with you right now. Like you've extended the pattern into online shopping. And so the first step is to question that belief, pause, and then ask yourself, is this a belief system that benefits me, or is it to my detriment?
Right.
In the case of the online shopping, well, if I go in person, I'm going to get a better fit. I might meet some people. I might get out and enjoy a sunny day. But if I'm coming from that place of fear where I'm going to just online shop because I don't want to deal with all of that, which one is more to my benefit? And there is no good, bad, right, or wrong when it comes to individual choice. So you get to decide. You might say, no, it actually is a bigger benefit to me to just shop online and not have to deal with what it brings up for me when I go in person. But you also might say, you know what, maybe I could do something different here and have a different result than when I did when I was younger.
So we're kind of going to be jumping around here, but just as things pop into, you know, kind of my mind and kind of your mind, how they work. And one thing that I do want to talk about as well as anxiety is depression. I kind of suffer from it a little bit, and I take Xanax every day. And I wonder how many people, what is the difference between anxiety and depression from a formal standpoint? Because I have heard that people get confused and say it's anxiety when in actuality it's depression and it's the other way around. And I don't know if that's a true statement or what.
Well, again, when we get into diagnosis psychologist, we have very specific things we're looking for.
Sure.
But if I were to simplify depression and anxiety, depression has different symptoms. You can have anxiety symptoms and depression. You can have depression symptoms and anxiety. You can have anxiety and depression. But when it comes to depression, it's, I should say this, both anxiety and depression are chemical imbalances that we need to get in check. We get into different degrees, right? There's mild depression all the way up to clinical depression. Mm-hmm. For anxiety, there's mild anxiety all the way up into panic disorder, right? Mm-hmm. So it kind of depends on where you weigh in terms of what your symptoms are going to look like. I like to sort of simplify it. So at the root of depression is always, I don't like my reality. At the root of anxiety is always, I'm not good enough or I'm doing something wrong. Mm-hmm. And so we kind of use those roots to pattern, at least I do, to pattern the therapeutic approach. So with anxiety, we're going to look more at the self-esteem issues. And with depression, we're going to look more at empowerment, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. But when you get into the higher end of like clinical or panic disorders, we do have to introduce medication oftentimes, or do extreme behavioral therapy techniques so that we can just get the person stabilized before we can even get into some of the deeper roots.
I've been on anxiety and depression medicine since I was probably 9th or 10th grade of high school. And what's crazy is, and this kind of lead into the next subject, is I was taking this one medication till maybe a year out of high school. And I realized that the doctor had put me on a medication that was only supposed to work for a certain amount of time. Like it was only supposed to work for like 6 months to a year. And I had been taking it for 3 or 4 years. And my body was just so accustomed to it. And then when the new doctor was like, hey, this stuff is only for this amount of time. You've got to quit that and start this. And I remember being addicted to that medicine that I had been taking for 3 or 4 years because I thought in my mind that it was helping me, when in actuality, nothing was happening. It was like the placebo effect. And I remember getting off that medicine and that's why I've never done hard drugs. Never, just because the anxiety medicine was enough trying to get off of it. It was like digging into the button of your mattress, just literally trying to calm yourself and figure out you're okay, you're fine, trying to calm yourself. And then now it's like, okay, I only take this anxiety medicine when I need it instead of all the time because of the thing that happened before. So right. Do you see that a lot?
I see a lot of misinformation out there about medication. You could literally do an entire episode on the pros, cons, do's and don'ts of medication. But here's what I know to be true. If I'm going to refer someone to get on medication, which I typically don't do unless they're in that extremely severe or clinical or panic disorder phase, unless they need to be stabilized. But if I'm going to refer someone, I'm going to recommend they go to a psychiatrist because, I think internal medicine doctors and general practitioners are wonderful in their careers, right? I want someone to go to someone who is specialized in medication for the brain, right? There's so many medications out there, and they all have different side effects, and they all are dependent on the individual taking them. And so initially getting on medication, people should be closely monitored.
Sure.
And the problem is that people aren't getting enough information about the medication they're taking oftentimes. Mm-hmm. I've had clients who come in and been on medication, like let's say like a Wellbutrin, and they're like, well, I just decided to stop it. That's not a medication you can just stop. That is a medication that you need to titrate off, meaning come off slowly. And most medications have some sort of titration recommendation, or if you get into the benzodiazepines like Xanax, like you mentioned earlier, you don't ever have that with alcohol, right? But a lot of people aren't aware of that. And so it's like having as much information about the medication you're on is really, really important. most medications are not designed to be on long term. We have some cases, who have episodes of psychosis that probably do need to be on it for lifelong. There's severe cases of different diagnoses that need to be on it long term. But most people, antidepressants were originally created just to get people stabilized. 3 to 6 months. People stay on it for years and years and years and years.
That kind of opens up a whole new realm for me, because my medication states that I'm supposed to take it once a day, and I don't, just because of that addiction that I had before to that one anxiety medicine. And I wonder, is that bad of what I'm doing? Am I hurting myself in the long run because of that? And I only take it when I need it? Because I know we're going into the whole nother ball field, but
yeah. I think that's a conversation to have with your doctor. If you're going to up your medication or lower your medication, then let your practitioner know, to say, hey, I'm able to take this less and I feel like I'm still okay. And just make sure that that's in line with how that medication works. And then same with if you feel like you get to a point where you need to take more, let the doctor know.
Sure.
Because some of these medications, like especially when you get into the amphetamine medications, the benzodiazepine medications, those are highly addictive drugs, and they do need to be closely monitored by the practitioners.
Right. And I think I'm trying to speak for everybody when I'm asking these questions, because I know if I have the questions, there's 1,000 other people that have the same questions. But you have a new podcast coming out. I do. I want you to talk about this. How did you get the idea of doing a podcast, and what is the podcast going to be about, and when is it going to be released?
The podcast came about during the pandemic, when I really saw sort of what was going on in the country in terms of division. And mainly what I'm referring to was division in politics, division in, we had race division, we had class division, we had mask versus non-maskers, vaccinators versus non-vaccinators. And it's just this division.
Yeah.
And, as we were talking about, this fear-based belief system that we've kind of adopted globally, right?
Absolutely.
And we really need to make that flip back into a state of love. We can talk about every emotion under the sun, but really there's only 2 emotions, love and fear. And we've been operating in a fear space, right? So what I was trying to think about was what would be a catalyst? What would be one way for us to move back towards a more love-centered society? And really, when you break it down, it's knowing each other, being able to have empathy and compassion and experience what others experience, or realizing that we're all having the same experiences, we just look different, right? So the show is called Walk Me Through That with Deborah Riley, and it is a production of the I Am Beast Network. The I Am Beast Network is a network owned by Andre the Beast Creighton, who has his own show actually on Roku called the Andre the Beast Creighton Show. And he heard about our show, was excited about our show, and asked actually to produce our show. So the premise of the show is every episode we have someone on, and it'll be someone who's could be gay, could be straight, could be black, could be white, could be Republican, could be Democrat, doesn't matter, but they come on the show to share one experience, either a trial or a triumph. Ooh. And they just share that one experience in depth, so that hopefully the listeners will say, wow, I've experienced that, or I have felt that way. Yeah. And that person is very different from me, so that we can start to see our similarities more than our differences.
That's crazy, because I didn't think I was going to get to this point to talk about that, because I didn't really know what the podcast was about. But when you say that, that's very interesting, because when the pandemic happened and the Black Lives Matter thing happened, right? And the towns are being destroyed and stuff like that. We had something here. It was a peaceful protest where we just went into the park and we just shared stories. And I remember when I went and there were pictures taken and it surfaced online and I had posted that I was there, kind of the hurt that my family got. I was getting pounded because I'm from the southern state of Mississippi. We're supposed to be all lives matter instead of just this one certain race. But then I realized within this that everyone is just stuck in their mindset, because here it's, if you're raised with, you don't question what school says, you don't question, what you learned growing up. If you don't, you're not supposed to question that. But I was the one that went out of the way and I questioned everything. I was like, well, look, there has to be a deeper meaning. There has to be this. And it was like, one of my uncles that I was very close with, I got called the black sheep of the family and I got casted out. And it hurt me to a point where I was like, you know what? I'm doing this for the right reasons, but it's not working. I had a different endpoint in my mind and I thought everyone was going to be one with me. And it's like, it's not. And kind of the same thing when Republican, Democrat, I grew up tremendously Republican, because people didn't realize here that they were like, Republicans are what God wants. Democrats are what the world wants. That was what I was taught my whole entire life. And then when I seen whatever, nobody listening or you, don't take your views out of it, but after what I saw, what had happened with Trump, I was like, I'm going to go a different route. And let's vote for Biden this time. I understand what he likes. I agree with 60% of what he does versus the Republican side, which is 40%. Let's do that. And it was a cast out. I was the black sheep. I was not doing what God wanted. And now it's like, you're questioning the Bible because you voted Democrat. And I'm like, people don't understand. And I think that hurts a lot of people in different ways. So I appreciate that you're doing a podcast about this, because sure, there may be some like that, but I have a feeling with you, a lot of stuff, that this is just going to be a different type of podcast to what we've seen.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, even to what you were saying earlier, you made the comment, everyone was saying you need to be all lives matter instead of Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
And what people don't understand is that all lives can't matter
Exactly.
until Black Lives matter.
100%.
And that's kind of like, in a way, an example of what I'm going for on the show. We can't get to a place of all until we understand everyone. And so hopefully the podcast will be looked at as a safe place for whoever wants to come on, whether that is the Republicans you're describing or the Democrats, and by the way, I don't want to hear about your politics on my show. I want to know what happened. How did you get through the loss of your child?
Sure.
You know what I'm saying? Like, we're not going to talk about these hotbed issues. We're going to talk about, tell me about who you are in your essence. I don't want your moniker of Republican or Democrat or black or white or gay or straight. I want to know tell me about your essence, so that because when we expose ourselves in a vulnerable way, we invite everybody else to do the same. And when we start putting that vulnerable energy out there, guess what? That's a healing energy. That exposed, vulnerable energy can heal, because it comes from a place of love and light versus judgment and separate. Does that make sense?
It makes 100% sense, because what you're doing with the podcast is you're like, look, keep your views out of it. But if you were kind of put out there for being this gay person or this black person, I want to know what happened and how you got through it. Walk me through your steps of realizing that it doesn't really matter because I am who I am.
Yeah. One of the episodes we filmed was a very moving episode. And it was actually with a man who's well known for bodybuilding and you know, has achieved a lot. And he talks very openly about the custody battle he had over his daughter. He had a daughter whose mother abandoned at very early age, comes back a year and a half later, takes the child back. He actually had to battle for 2 years to get custody. And he talks about that very difficult time. He saw a period of homelessness, a period of extreme mental duress, trying to get his daughter back, which he ultimately did get back, but 2 years later, right? And so what was interesting is that he was Black, the mother was white. He was male, trying to get custody in a court system. So we kind of see his struggle as a Black father trying to get custody in a state that really favors mothers, right? Traditionally. And we're not talking about that directly. We're talking about what that was like for him. So hopefully when people watch the episode, they'll be able to relate, and it really won't even be about all those other things. It'll be about, here's a man who really was unfairly treated in the court system as he was trying to get custody of his daughter.
You know, I am a strong advocate for, and I'm trying to find someone to do an episode, because I'm fighting to change the foster care system. I have talked to these higher ups, and I'm like, well, we have to do something about how the foster care system, how these kids are treated in foster cares, because a percentage of most of these people that are there, it revolves in teen pregnancies, and they go to jail, and all this stuff happens. And you can take that, like I've said this before, and I think someone else has said it, but it's like, if a mother is trying her hardest to keep these 3 kids fed, and she is out there and she has to sell her body because what she's doing is not making it, instead of coming in there, taking these kids away from their brothers, their sisters, the house they know, the mother they know, instead of taking them away because what the mother has to do to support them, why can't you give them a job so you don't have to take the kids away? You know, and I know that's a touchy subject, but it's kind of the same realm of what you just mentioned about the custody battles.
Well, the foster care system is a huge topic in of itself.
Yeah, right.
But what we know, and why I agree with you that is important, is you know, we went through this recent phase where in my profession, where everybody came forward and said, you know, the past doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what happened in the past. Let's move towards solution-based focus, therapy, where what's happening now is what matters. It doesn't matter what happened. But what we know from science is that that is a disservice to people that come to us for treatment, because in actuality, the developmental years, especially the first 2 months of birth, have huge impact on our mental state and well-being all the way into an adulthood. So when we look at something like the foster care, we're really talking about quality child care for all, right? And making sure that mothers and fathers are supported so that they're providing the best environments for their children to thrive and grow and develop.
Right.
You know, I mean, it's a huge issue that should be addressed. All of this stuff we're talking about, Dylan, I mean, that was one of the things that was frustrating for me during the election, is that I didn't really hear either party talk about the mental health crisis we're in. And we are in a mental health crisis.
Absolutely.
Suicide is up, depression is up, anxiety is up, relapse is up. We are collectively experiencing trauma. And you know, at the same time, we're having economic impact, which is, you know, affecting people's insurance and ability to get medication. I've had clients who have stopped medication they shouldn't stop halved medication that shouldn't be halved in half.
Mhm.
It's a huge crisis that nobody's really talking about.
Absolutely. Deb, I don't know what else to say. It's just been a strong episode, which I think everybody needs every now and then, because a lot of people don't think the pandemic is a mental but it's a mental game. Life is a mental game. It's if you're going to go through life being negative, then don't accept positive outcomes. Always accept negative outcomes. If you're somewhere in between, then you need to get somewhat more positive than you are negative, because I see a lot of people where they're just this negative Nancy, and then they get this job interview, and then they're like, I don't know what I did wrong. I didn't get the job. Well, you weren't thinking positively. You were thinking probably you're on the outside. You were like, I'm so hyped, I'm going to get this job. But on the inside, you were like, I'm not that good of a person. This job's going to suck. I'm not going to be that good at it. And the outcome was that inside feeling that you got came true because of the mindset that you had.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think you're absolutely right. There's a great book out there called The Seat of the Soul.
Absolutely.
And in that book, I believe it's by Michael Singer. I hope I got that right. But anyway, in the book, there's an example that he uses that I think is a really good illustration of what you're talking about. And he's talking about the person that gets their heart broken. Their partner leaves, and he's not showering, and he's laying on the couch ordering pizza, and he's depressed, for days and days, not going to work. And then he gets a phone call from the girlfriend who says that she's, made a mistake and wants to come back. And instantly he's off the couch, showering, happy. What has changed in that moment is his energy and where he's putting it, right? He was putting energy into depression in one minute. The next minute, he's putting the energy back into hope and happiness. And I think that's a good illustration of how we are not our mind, right? And I've said this before. I can wake up in the morning and say, this is a beautiful sunny day, or I can wake up in the morning and say, this is a hot, shitty day. Right. It's the same day, but I'm going to have a very different experience based on which thought pattern I decide to go down, where I'm going to put my energy. And so just collectively, I would like to see us move towards taking our energy away from fear and that whole what if cycle, what if, and moving it into that love section that says, even if, right? Moving away from what if into even if, fear versus love.
There's a saying out there, and it's every day is a good day. That's probably not true, but you have the opportunity to make every day a good day. It's just, how are you going to approach that day? Your car breaks down in the morning. You got a flat tire. You're late for work. Instantly a bad day. No, because if you look, there's probably an inner thing, and it's probably, I don't really believe in luck, but it's probably luck that you didn't happen because there was a wreck about the time that you were going to be on the highway. There was this that was going to happen. But it's all leads to positive thinking. It's, why did my tire go flat? I could have wrecked and the tire blew out. That's why it's flat when I got up this morning. It's, instead of being, this is a badass, I hate this shit, I can't stand it. It's all, well, hang on a second. Yeah. Let's breathe. Let's bring this to positive, because there's a inner lining of why something bad has happened.
It's moving away from that ego state that I was talking about, which says I'm a victim of my tire being flat, right? I'm a victim here. Mm-hmm. And into, oh, my tire's flat, I guess I'll have to fix it, without putting this label of good, bad, right, or wrong on it, right? Mm-hmm. Just letting something just be and not attaching a story of lack to it.
So your podcast, walk me through it with Deborah Riley. Is it out now? And if it is, where can people?
It is not out now.
Okay.
We are actually going to be releasing the teaser probably next week. It will be airing on the IMB's network, Roku Channel, when it comes out. We're still working out all those kinks, but definitely I will let you know when we have an air date. It's exciting though. I'm looking forward to it.
Me too. I'm definitely interested in hearing that whole bodybuilder's story. that was kind of a great teaser to a good start of, you don't know when it's going to come out, but this is going to be a badass show. But look, Deb,
Yeah.
I appreciate you coming out here, and I thank our friend Eric for hooking us up, because I don't think there was anybody else that could have done a show like this. And hopefully
Yeah.
we can do this again sometime, because it's great to have.
Absolutely.
It's great to have not a brainwash segment, but something that cleanses the brain. I guess that's what I can call it.
Well, I appreciate you having me on, Dylan. I've had a great time.
All right. Thank you, Deb. You have a good day.
Thanks. You too.
All right. Bye.